Welcome to the MAM journals, and this is the first of the last series for the year. Today I'm going to be talking about two tribute bikes from Kawasaki. Obviously we'll need to talk about what they're actually tributes to and how that works. I want to go through the specifications and compare them for you, and got some GoPro footage for you to have a look at while I talk about what the bikes are like to ride. I then, because both of these bikes are well supported in groups and forums, I want to share some of the activity I've done on that this year, and finally I'm going to come back and make some concluding comments, and I will skirt round try to answer the two questions I invariably get asked when people know that I have both, which is, well, which is the best bike, and if you could only keep one, which one would you keep? I hope you enjoy the video, and we'll start by talking about what the bikes are tributes to. This bike is, of course, a tribute to a much earlier generation of bikes, the Z900RS, which enjoyed enormous success on the track with a rider called Eddie Lawson. Steady Eddie he was called, but he was fast enough to win 2 AMA Superbike Championships, 4 what we now call MotoGP Championships, twice a winner at Daytona 200 and the Suzuka 8-hour race, so no slouch. And this particular combination of colours is really synonymous with that Eddie Lawson style look. Now, at the time they did a number of replicas, some very serious of the race bike and some less so, and they were doing it to really try and get the bikes sold, because new technology was really emerging very quickly at the time. So this level of technology was considered sort of old hat. The Hondas were working on their liquid-cooled V4, which they called the Sabre in America, and indeed Kawasaki were working on the brilliant Z900. So although the enhancements helped sell the old stock of those 80s bikes, it was definitely something that they were looking to move away from. This bike didn't sort of come about until much later, and it was triggered by Suzuki's launching of the Bandit, which was a relatively powerful bike, little technology, easy to ride. A UJM, as we used to call them. Now, the first sort of version of the ZRX was the actual 1100, which came out in 97. The 1200 came out in 2001, and in Europe it sold until 2007, while in the States it didn't sell particularly well, and they dropped it from the range in 2005. Now, this is one of the very last of them, because it's actually a 2008 registered, although it is a 2007 bike. They were difficult to sell, and they were £6,500 new, which ironically the bike's probably worth more now. And by the way, no, it's not for sale. This bike, the RS, is of course a direct tribute to the fabulous 1973 Z1. It was launched in 2017 and arrived in the UK in 2018, and really to capture the retro market that was in full swing at that stage. Some manufacturers go for pastiches really of older bikes, but this is pretty close in terms of its design concept to the original, although some would argue it's not as pretty. The bike has sold very well. There's a couple of versions of it really. They've done various colours. They nicely tie back into the heritage of the original Z1 through colour schemes. And this particular one is called a yellow ball and happens to have slightly enhanced levels of equipment in terms of suspension and brakes. The engine is the same as the standard bike. The original Z1 won Motorcycle News's readers' votes Bike of the Year for 4 years running, which had never been done before and it's never been done since. It's interesting to note that this bike actually has also won an MCN award as Retro Bike of the Year. Okay, so let's do some comparison on the specifications. I prefer to start with the engines. They're both 4-cylinder, 4 strokes, inline, dual overhead cams, 16 valves, and they're both liquid cooled. The ZRX has got 1164 cc's. It's fitted with these Cayenne KVK36s, obviously 4 of them. The bike produces 122 PS at 8,500 revs, and it produces 112 newton meters of torque at 7,000. The bike's been road tested. I tried various sources to try and get some accuracy on this, but the consensus seems to be 147 miles per hour. Whilst we're looking at the bike, and I'm just talking about carburetors, I just thought it might be useful if I explain what I do to try and help protect it from the dangers of ethanol getting in there, because it has a process, ethanol and fuel, they have a process called phased separation, and essentially what it means is the water and the ethanol go to the bottom and clog up the carburetors and tank unless you do something to restrict it. What I do every time I put the bike away is I actually use Tetra Boost. Other products are available, by the way, and I just literally, for this this is 50 millilitres, and 1 milliliter does 1 litre. It's a 19 litre tank, so I get 19 of that, measure it out in my syringe, pop it in, slosh it about, and hopefully I'll end up with a bike that starts in the spring. Okay, this engine is a 948cc and it's fuel injected, thank heavens. It produces 111 PS, so slightly less than ZRX, and again its torque is slightly less. It produces 98.5 at 6,500 revs. This bike has been tested by Bike Magazine at 143 miles per hour. Right, so let's talk about the dimensions of the bikes. The ZRX is wheelbase, i.e. the contact point of the tyres at both ends is 1465 millimetres, and the rake of the bike is 25 degrees. The rims and wheels, it's got 17-inch wheels, a 3.5 front rim and a 5.5 rear rim, and it's fitted with 120/70 tyres and at the front and 180/55 at the back. Interestingly, both bikes share the same wheel size and tyre dimensions. The only difference in terms of these dimensions that we're talking about on this bike is actually this bike is slightly longer in the wheelbase, 5 millimetres. So in terms of these dimensions that we're just talking about, very little difference between the bikes. They share the 25-degree rake, and as I've just said, they share the tyre and wheel dimensions. And whilst we're talking about dimensions, one thing which is quite interesting, although the ZRX feels definitely a bigger, bulkier bike, despite the dimensions not always supporting that, these bars are quite a bit narrower than the RS bars. Okay, in terms of weight, well, you probably won't be surprised to hear that the ZRX is the heavier of the two at 246 kilos. It certainly feels a bigger bike. That tank is 19 litres, but in some ways, one of the measurements, this seat height is actually lower. This is 790 millimetres. And of course, one of the differences on the ZRX is it's got this front screen. This is called the R version in this. They did 3 versions. They did an S, which was a half-fed version. It's got a slightly different headlamp arrangement. And then they did, I think it was called the C, which was a naked version with a round headlamp. I've got some footage which shows you certainly the S a bit later on. The RS is 215 kilograms, which is, if you say it quickly, doesn't sound like much difference, but that's 31 bags of sugar less. So that's quite a big difference. The tank is slightly smaller. That's a 17-litre tank. And the seat height, and particularly on this bike, there is, on a standard bike, it's 835 millimeters in terms of height, so bigger than the standard ZRX. And the SE, because it's got differences to the suspension and what they're trying to do with it, is actually 845, which was frankly too tall for me. So I've gone for the low seat, so this is 810. And as you can see, there's no screen. This is completely naked at the front. Okay, so let's talk about the ZRX suspension and brakes. As standard, this is a standard bike. It came with these KYBs, which are, and obviously it's a twin shock. You've got a little bit of adjustment on there, but it doesn't do much, to be honest. And you have got some fairly basic adjustment up here on the forks, as you can see. In terms of braking, they have, on the front brake, both bikes have got twin discs at the front and a single at the rear. These are 310 millimeter discs with these 6 pots, which weren't universally popular because they can sort of clog up a bit. I always think the best way to find out whether a design worked or not is to see whether they continued doing it in later models, and they didn't, so I guess the proof is in the pudding. This bike, obviously the RS, is the SE version, so it has got enhanced rear suspension with the Öhlins units here, which give you considerably more adjustability than the standard unit, which isn't, again, using that phrase, it's not universally popular on the standard bike, but it's okay. Front forks are the standard tubes, but they have got 3 separate parts in there which are different in connection to valving, and so they sort of, the pair is matched. This bike also has the Brembo brake edition on the front there, and they're actually slightly smaller discs. They're 300 millimeter discs, and at the rear it's the same as the ZRX. They're 250 millimeter disc. Both bikes are chain drive, and this bike the ZRX is fitted with a 5-speed gearbox and hasn't got much in the way of technology. It was actually old school when it was new, so that won't have improved over time. There's very basic control systems there. There's no ABS on this bike, there's no traction control, and indeed, sadly, there's no gear indicator, which I'll come back to later when we go for a ride. This bike is a 6-speed gearbox, and as I touched on, both the chain drive as well, and has significantly more technology, although it's not at the leading edge of technology by modern bike standards. Clearly it's got ABS, it's got pretty basic traction control, it's got range indicators on there and various other bits which help fit, a gear indicator, and one of the other things it's obviously got fitted is a catalytic converter, which is not on the ZRX. Right, so as you can see, there's many similarities of the bike, but there are some key differences. The ZRX has a screen, it's carburetors, you've got a 5-speed gearbox versus a 6-speed. The ZRX is heavier, but more powerful, and the bike is, although the dimensions are very similar in lots of ways, is a more bulky bike, and not surprisingly, the more modern tribute to a different bike, the RS, has got more technology and the catalytic converter. So how different are they to ride? And we start with a traditional Kawasaki clunk. Riding in town is not my favourite motorcycling, but it is for most of us part of it. The ZRX is surprisingly light and easy to ride in traffic, and the narrow bars and low seat make filtering, legal in the UK but not in some other countries, refreshingly straightforward. With traditional carburettors, the throttle response is seamlessly smooth. The hydraulic clutch, light and progressive. The RS is certainly not difficult to ride in traffic. The bike is lighter and very precise. But town work does, however, reveal its weaknesses. For me, quite tall without the lowered seat and the occasional snatchy throttle at about 2,500 revs, combined with a slight low revs clutch judder, can make riding in traffic less fun than I think it should be. It's okay, nothing that any of us can't cope with, but the ZRX is perhaps surprisingly better. Once on the open road, the RS's light and easygoing nature shows its capabilities. With a great induction noise, willingness to rev, nice chassis and suspension, the bike makes easy progress. It is effortless to ride, and although some complain about the gearbox, I have found both of my bikes smooth and easy to engage. The clutch nicely facilitating matched rev changes. Brakes are good, predictable and progressive, and although this SE has upgraded brakes, and you can feel it, I never found the standard brakes wanting. The upgraded suspension on this model is to me a significant improvement and takes forward control and ride. I'm not a fast rider, but I can certainly feel the improvements in handling on this bike. The bike cruises at 70 miles an hour with about 4,500 to 4,600 revs in sixth, although I personally tend to use sixth as an overdrive, overtaking in third, fourth and occasionally fifth. The ZRX, with nearly 14% more torque, is more of what I call a muscle bike. It feels heavier, of course, but the engine pushes and pulls it on nicely, particularly in the early stages. I actually don't know any ZRX owners who don't try to find sixth in the 5-speed gearbox. A digital display would certainly have helped us all, but once you've accepted you're already in top, 4,000 revs is 70 miles per hour. At these revs the bike feels smooth, and you could certainly ride all day on it effortlessly. Clearly it is capable of much more, but if you want to get it spinning you do need to ask it fairly firmly, as we would say, a full handful. It will definitely go, but there is more, I'm going to call it inertia, in the engine than the free-flowing and free-revving RS. In normal riding, the ZRX is poised, secure and stable. It feels planted. A little bit of crosswind won't be troubling this bike. I have actually tried to hustle it along a few times, but with a standard suspension it doesn't take much to get it excited. It is a heavy bike and feels big, and once you've run out of rear grip it gets pretty lively pretty quickly. A lot of faster riders do modify them, and I can understand why. Personally, I am happy with it as it is. I feel I ride it how it wants to be ridden. Initially I found the front forks far too soft, but once the excellent Larry Webb at PDQ in Slough cleaned out the mud that was once fork oil and replaced the worn out front spring, it was significantly better. Still softer than the RS, but at least back to as new performance levels. Brakes on the ZRX are okay, but no surprise here, not as good as the later models. Time moves on. The additional weight of the ZRX doesn't help. It would be easy to assume that the small bikini screen is purely aesthetic, but in reality For a rider of my height, 1.72 metres or 5'8" if you prefer your measurements in old money, it does reduce buffeting if not wind noise. The RS is naked and on longer straight line runs can be tiring. The ZRX is bulkier and in some areas broader. Appropriately equipped, I know it can carry a lot of luggage, and the space, as we've seen, under the seat has plenty of room for additional items. The RS can carry and travel abroad, but perhaps not quite so easily. On a local run, both bikes, ridden sensibly, are brisk, entertaining and charismatic, but with very distinct personalities. I suspect identical riders setting off to the same destination using a varied road route would actually arrive simultaneously. But they would have actually had very different but equally enjoyable riding experiences. Both of these bikes have attracted a very loyal following, and in this digital age, social media groups, Facebook in particular, are very well supported. I am a member of both ZRX and RS groups, and whenever possible attend the meetings organised. It's a great way to meet like-minded people, and I have found both groups welcoming, good-natured, knowledgeable and very helpful. They are also fun. Some owners keep their bikes fairly standard, but others go the whole hog, modifying to their heart's content. It is, of course, a labour of love. The ZRX can be improved significantly with alterations to the suspension front and rear and brakes. I had the opportunity to ride Dave Scholes' ZRX at the summer meet and was very impressed with the handling. He had transformed the bike. I took the opportunity to ask him what he'd done and why. Right, I'm here at the ZRX meeting at the Super Sausage, which is near Toaster or Silverstone if you're thinking circuits, and there's a fair few bikes here which I'll have a little wander around in a moment, but I'm here talking to Dave Scholes and about his bike, what he's done to it. So Dave, can you just talk us through what modifications you've done on this bike?
Basically, the front end is, rather than conventional forks, is now upside down forks off a ZZR 1400 with Brembo monoblock calipers. I've improved the master cylinders with Brembo radial. Lightened the wheels by fitting BST carbon fibre wheels. Ollins rear shocks. That's about it really for the main stuff. I've put my own strengthened brace swinging arm on it and a full titanium Japanese exhaust system.
The wrong colour, but we'll let you off.
Obviously a custom seat, but that doesn't affect any performance. It's got one-off yokes from America.
And what have you done up here on the...
Oh, it's a Corso TFT digital gauge cluster, which gives you far more information than you need.
What information don't you need?
Well, if something goes wrong, you usually know before the gauge tells you, I think. There's a lot of little other bits, but those are the major points.
You made the decision not to improve the engine. What was your thinking?
It's perfectly adequate for what I want. Absolutely no need. I've done the turbocharged high capacity engines and I nearly killed myself, so I'm happy now. Nothing to prove.
Others go further. Rob Williams' unique Graham Crosby tribute is a real feat of engineering and commitment. Something very special. The Z900RS UK Facebook group has also organised meetings, although rain sadly curtailed attendance at some this year. I meet up with several members quite regularly, and like the ZRX group, the bikes are both standard and highly modified. This bike, owned by Simon Freeman, is a stunning combination of aesthetic and performance enhancements. The most common improvements on the RS are small aesthetic touches, like tail tidies, etc., and for some, the mapping of the ECU to smooth out the throttle. On the ZRX side, the most common alterations I see appear to be the rear shocks, Öhlins being the favoured choice, and the rear silencer, which probably makes more difference to the sound than the power, but is understandably popular. Good-natured ribbing prevails in both groups, but it is of course completely obvious to all that the fastest ZRXs are green and the fastest RSs the yellow ball. Right, so have I come to any sort of conclusions as a result of doing the review? Well, I think they're both very good bikes, they're good tributes, and obviously I've bought them both, so I do like them. Town and touring, possibly the ZRX might have the edge. Country blasts, perhaps the more agile and engaging ride of the RS. Going back to the start when I said that a couple of questions invariably get asked, and the first one, when people say to me, well, which do you prefer? Well, frankly, I love them both, so it's a bit like asking me which is my favourite daughter. So I'm not going to get off the fence with that one. The second sort of question they say is, well, if you only had one, that's sort of only one game. And if somebody came down and asked me that question, if I'm honest, I'd probably tell them to mind their own business. I'm happy with both. I've bought both, and that's the way it's going to stay. Finally, I've slightly unusually, included some of the sort of social stuff that I do on bikes within this video, and I think that's an important part, certainly for me, of motorcycling. And the opportunity to meet people with a shared passion is good fun. In a world where we seem increasingly divided by our differences, it's great to find common ground. I know not everybody likes to join these sort of forums and go to the various meets, but I think one nice thing we could all do as motorcyclists is when we see one another on the road, it costs nothing for a small wave or a flash of your lights. We are, after all, kindred spirits. As always, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, you might want to press like or consider subscribing. But what is most important is that you ride safe and you stay well.